There's something nobody tells you about growing up with a hero for a father. They don't tell you what it feels like when that hero turns out to be something else entirely. They don't tell you about the specific kind of shame that lives in your chest for years afterward, the kind that isn't really yours to carry, but you carry it anyway because nobody's going to carry it for you. My name is Adrian Cole, and I've spent most of my adult life trying to outrun the shadow of a man who loved me enough to lie to me every single day. This story starts long before I was born. It starts with two men, a woman, and a rivalry that got passed down like a bad inheritance, father to son, fist to fist, badge to badge. And it ends, well, I'll get to how it ends. But I need you to understand something first. I am not the villain of this story. Neither is my father. That's the part that took me the longest to accept. My father's name was Kenneth Cole, but everyone in Millhaven, Ohio, called him Kenny. He was the kind of man who could charm his way into or out of just about anything. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a laugh that filled whatever room he walked into. He had this habit of spinning a pen between his fingers when he was thinking, and he almost never got caught doing anything wrong because he always looked like he was thinking about something honest. He wasn't. My mother, Patricia, was a cop. A good one. She worked out of the 3rd District Station and had a reputation for being sharp and no-nonsense. The kind of officer who remembered every plate number she ever ran, every face from a lineup, every detail from every report she ever filed. Which makes what happened between her and my father either the greatest con job in Millhaven history, or the most tragic love story, depending on how you look at it. The way my grandmother told it, Kenny met Patricia at a neighborhood block party in the summer. He showed up wearing a borrowed uniform, a friend's police uniform, as it turned out, from a friend who'd washed out of the academy 2 years prior. He was there on a dare, something stupid between him and his crew. The dare was to stay in the uniform for the whole party without getting caught. He didn't just stay for the whole party. He went home with Patricia's phone number. She thought he was a detective. He let her think that. And then he kept letting her think it, week after week, date after date. Because, according to him, in the one honest conversation they ever had about it before he died, he had never in his life met anyone who looked at him the way she did when she thought he was someone worth respecting. She looked at me like I was the real thing, he told her, and I didn't want that to stop. By the time she figured out the truth, not all of it, not the worst of it, just that he wasn't actually a cop, she was already pregnant with me. And Kenny, to his credit or his cowardice, depending on who you ask, got down on one knee in her mother's kitchen and proposed with a ring he'd bought legitimately, from a pawn shop, with money he'd earned doing roofing jobs for 3 straight weeks. She said yes. She told herself it was the love talking. Maybe it was. Maybe she just needed it to be. I grew up in that house on Carver Street believing my father was a detective. He left the house every morning in slacks and a button-down, and he came home every evening smelling like cigarettes and take-out coffee. And he had opinions about police work that sounded real, because he'd been listening to my mother talk about it for years. He knew the names of her coworkers. He knew the shift schedules. He knew when to change the subject. I didn't know a single thing about the man my father actually was until I was 9 years old. And neither, I think, did he, not really. Because the thing about living a lie long enough is that you start to become it. You start to believe you've earned it. You start to think the version of yourself that other people see is the version that matters. Until the day it all collapses. Half a block down from us, in the yellow house with the basketball hoop in the driveway, lived the Chenu family. Gerald Chenu was a real cop. Not a detective, a patrol officer, worked the same district as my mother, drove the same roads, went to the same briefings. He was a quiet man, not unfriendly, just economical. He said what needed to be said and nothing more. He coached youth basketball at the rec center on Thursday nights and showed up to every neighborhood association meeting with a yellow legal pad and a pen. His son was Victor Chenu, and Victor was my best friend and my worst enemy for as far back as I can remember. We were in the same kindergarten class. We sat at the same table. We both loved the same superhero cartoons and both hated the same substitute teacher who always smelled like mentholated cough drops and called everyone sport. But from the very beginning, Victor and I were competitors. Not in a mean way, or not always in a mean way. It was more like we had some frequency between us that made everything feel like a contest. Who finished their worksheet first? Who could hold their breath longer? Who got picked first for kickball? Who got the better grade on the spelling test? It was Victor who first proposed the salute rule. We were 7. We'd been fighting about something stupid, I don't even remember what, and Victor stood up very seriously and said, "Okay. Whoever loses has to salute the winner." I laughed at him. "Like soldiers." "Like officers," he said, and he said it so seriously that I stopped laughing. We shook on it. And from that day on, every bet between us ended the same way. The loser standing stiff and straight, hand raised to their forehead, eyes forward, while the winner tried not to grin too big. Victor won more than I did in those early years. He was faster, more disciplined, more focused. Even as a kid, he had this quality of stillness that I never quite managed, this ability to sit with discomfort, and not fidget. His father had it too, that quality. It was like they both understood something about patience that hadn't been explained to me yet. There was one other thing about Gerald Chenoy that I didn't understand until I was much older. He was in love with my mother. Not in any inappropriate way, or at least, nothing that ever broke into the open. But my grandmother noticed, and years later she told me that Gerald Chenoy had asked Patricia out twice before Kenny Cole ever showed up at that block party. She'd said no both times, kindly, and they'd remained colleagues and neighbors and nothing more. But Gerald never quite stopped carrying it, and I think Kenny knew. I think that's part of why he and Gerald never said more than 6 words to each other at the end of the driveway or over the fence. There was something between them that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. Victor didn't know any of this. I didn't know any of this. We just knew we were rivals, and we kept competing. And I kept losing by just enough to make me desperate to catch up. It happened on a Tuesday in October when I was 9 years old. I remember it was a Tuesday because I had soccer practice, and my mother had picked me up early because she said my dad was coming home for dinner, and we were going to eat as a family, which didn't happen every night. I remember being annoyed about missing practice. I remember the smell of my cleats in the back seat. I don't remember exactly when I realized something was wrong. We turned onto our street and there were police cars. 3 of them, lights going, parked at angles the way they only park when something's happening right now. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, mostly neighbors, some people I recognized, standing in that particular way that people stand when they know they shouldn't be watching but can't make themselves leave. My mother's hands went white on the steering wheel. She said very quietly, "Stay in the car." I did not stay in the car. I got out and pushed through the edge of the crowd to see what they were seeing. My father was on his knees in the driveway of the Murphys' house, 4 doors down from ours. His hands were zip-tied behind his back. There were 2 officers standing over him, and one of them was talking into his radio. The Murphys' back door was open. Their garage window was broken. And my father, this man who I believed was a detective, who I believed spent his days catching people who did exactly this kind of thing, was on his knees on someone else's driveway with his hands tied behind his back, and his face was pointing at the ground. I stood there and I couldn't process it. I genuinely could not make my brain accept what I was seeing. I kept thinking there had to be an explanation. He was undercover. It was a training exercise. Something. But then one of the neighbors, Mrs. Galton, who'd lived next door to us for as long as I could remember, turned and saw me standing there. And the look on her face was not confusion. It was not surprise. It was pity. The deep, specific pity of someone who already knew and had been waiting for this moment. "Oh, Adrian, honey," she said and reached for me. I stepped back from her hand. I stepped back from the whole crowd. I turned around and I ran, and I didn't stop running until I was in my room with the door locked and my face against the wall, breathing into the paint, trying to understand what just happened to every true thing I had ever believed. I heard my mother come inside. I heard her on the phone, voice low. I heard her sit down on the steps outside my door and not knock for a long time. When she finally knocked, I didn't answer. "Adrian," she said. "I know you saw." I pressed harder against the wall. "I'm going to tell you everything," she said. "Not tonight. Tonight I need you to know that I love you, and that none of this is your fault." I remember thinking with the particular brutality of a 9-year-old brain. If it's not my fault, then why do I feel like I'm the one being punished? I didn't say it out loud. I just stayed against the wall until she stopped sitting outside my door, and then I stayed there longer. My father didn't come home that night. He was released on bail the following morning. It was a first-time charge, technically, though as I'd eventually learn it was far from the first time he'd done it. He walked through the front door at around 9 a.m. with his shirt untucked and his eyes red. And I was sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal because it was a school day and I didn't know what else to do. He stopped when he saw me. I looked up at him. Neither of us said anything for what felt like a very long time. He walked to the table and pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. He put his hands on the table, flat, palms down, the way he used to when he was about to say something serious. I watched his hands. The pen wasn't there. He had nothing to spin between his fingers. Without it, his hands just looked big and still and useless. "I don't know where to start," he said. "You're not a detective," I said. "No, you never were." "No," I stirred my cereal. It had gotten soggy. "Did you ever even go to the academy?" He was quiet for a second. "No," I put the spoon down. "Adrian, don't." My voice cracked on it. I was 9 years old and my voice cracked, and I hated him for being the reason my voice cracked. "Don't say my name like that." He didn't say anything else. He just sat there with his hands on the table, and I got up and took my bowl to the sink and rinsed it out and went to get my backpack because it was a school day and I didn't know what else to do. He watched me the whole time. I could feel him watching. I stopped at the doorway and I said, without turning around, "Victor Chenoy's dad is a real cop." I don't know why I said that. I don't know what I meant by it exactly. I just knew it was the truest, meanest thing I could say in that moment, and something in me needed to say it. I heard him exhale behind me. Not a sigh, more like something leaving him. I walked out. I didn't look back. Part 5. The shame has an address. I've thought a lot over the years about what shame actually does to a person. Not guilt. Guilt is about something you did. Shame is about what you are or what other people decide you are, and it lives in a completely different place. My father knew shame. He'd been carrying it for years, I think. The specific shame of a man who'd built a life on a story that wasn't true, who'd looked at his son's admiration every morning and known he hadn't earned it. That kind of shame accumulates. It doesn't stay manageable. The week after he was caught, the story moved through the neighborhood the way stories move through small neighborhoods, fast and low, like smoke under a door. People who'd waved at my father for years looked at him differently when they passed him on the street. Some of them didn't wave at all. The Murphys, whose house he'd broken into, filed a full report and wanted prosecution, and my mother, who had her own humiliation to manage, her own career to protect, didn't fight them on it. She had every right to. But I think for my father, the specific agony wasn't the legal situation. It was me. He could not look at me without seeing it, the moment in that kitchen when I'd said Victor Chenoy's dad is a real cop and walked out the door. That sentence was a verdict, and no matter how many ways he tried to start the conversation over the following weeks, I wasn't ready to let him forget it. I was 9. I didn't have the emotional vocabulary to understand that I was punishing him. I just knew that everything I'd believed about my family was built on something false, and that falseness was humiliating, and humiliation needed somewhere to go. So it went at him. I stopped asking him about work. I stopped the small rituals we'd had, watching the game on Sundays, driving to the hardware store on Saturday mornings, the spinning pen trick he'd taught me to do when I was bored in class. I stopped performing the son I'd been before, and I couldn't yet perform a new one, so I was just absent. Even when I was in the same room, he felt it. Of course he felt it. And one morning, about 3 weeks after the arrest, I woke up and came downstairs, and my mother was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, and she told me my father wasn't home. "Where is he?" I asked. She took a long time before she answered. "He left a note," she said. "He says he loves us." I waited. She finally looked up at me. Her eyes were dry. My mother was not a woman who cried in front of people, not even me. But there was something broken and precise in her expression, like a watch face cracked down the middle, the hands still moving. "He's gone, Adrian." I understood that she meant he was gone. Not in the left his family sense, or not only in that sense. The note was on the kitchen counter. It was 3 paragraphs in my father's cramped handwriting, and I could only bring myself to read the last line before I folded it back up and handed it to my mother. The last line said, "Tell him I'm sorry I wasn't the real thing. Tell him the love was real even when nothing else was." I've carried that line for 27 years. Grief does strange things to a rivalry. In the weeks after my father died, Victor Chenoy didn't do what most of the other kids did, which was to either avoid me completely or approach me with the particular awful tenderness that made me feel like a charity case. Victor did neither. He showed up at my door on a Saturday morning 2 weeks after the funeral with a basketball under his arm. "You wanna run some?" he said. I stared at him. I'm just asking because I want to play," he said. "You don't have to if you don't want to." I went and got my shoes. We didn't talk about my father. We didn't talk about the arrest or the shame or any of it. We just played for 2 hours, and Victor beat me 4 games to 1, and at the end of it I raised my hand in a tired salute, and he accepted it, and we went our separate ways. That was the most decent thing anyone did for me that year. But Victor and I were too different in the wrong ways for it to stay simple. As we got older, our rivalry stopped being about basketball games and spelling tests, and started being about something more serious, about who we were becoming and what that meant. Victor wanted to be a cop. He'd always wanted to be a cop. His father was a cop, and he'd been absorbing everything about it since he was old enough to understand what the badge meant. He was disciplined in a way that I could never quite manage, organized, committed, focused. He studied when he said he'd study. He trained when he said he'd train. He was infuriatingly exactly what I always wished I could be. I, on the other hand, was my father's son. Not in the ways I would have chosen. Not the charm or the easy laugh or the ability to read a room. I got some of that. But I also got his impatience, his low tolerance for boredom, his willingness to take shortcuts when the long road felt too long. I'm not going to dress it up. By the time I was 17, I'd been brought in for questioning twice. Once for being with some guys who broke into a car. Once for something related to a stolen phone that I told myself I didn't know was stolen, even though I knew. I wasn't charged with anything. I was released both times with warnings and the specific look that cops give to kids who they've already decided are going in a bad direction. Victor knew, small neighborhood. He always knew. One evening, outside the rec center, he caught up with me while I was heading somewhere I shouldn't have been heading. He didn't say anything at first, just fell into step beside me, hands in his jacket pockets. "Where are you going?" he said. "Mind your business," I said. "I'm making it my business." "Why, because your dad asked you to? Because my mom called you?" "No," He stopped walking, and I stopped too because he had that stillness that made you stop. Because you're going to end up like him, Adrian, if you keep doing this, and I don't think you actually want that. I turned on him. I said things I'm not proud of. I brought up his father and my mother, and the history between the two of them that I only half understood. I used it like a weapon because it was the only weapon that reached him. Victor went very quiet. Then he said, in a voice so even it scared me a little, "I know you're in pain, but I'm not going to let you make me feel guilty for having a father who stayed." He walked away. I stood on the sidewalk and felt the specific humiliation of losing an argument to someone who was completely right. I didn't salute him, but I felt like I owed him one. There was a girl. There is always a girl in stories like this, and before you roll your eyes, let me tell you that she wasn't a plot device. She wasn't a prize. She was the person who, without really trying, held up a mirror to both of us and made us look at what we were. Her name was Diane Patel. She'd moved to Millhaven when we were sophomores, and she became friends with Victor before she became anything to me, which was just my particular bad luck. They were in the same AP history class, and they had this easy, comfortable rapport that I watched from a distance for several months before I did anything about it. Diane was the kind of person who noticed things. Not in a nosy way, in a careful way. She noticed when you were off. She noticed when you were lying, not with accusation, but with this slight tilt of her head that meant she'd seen through it and was waiting for you to catch up with her. She had dark eyes and this habit of tucking her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, and she laughed at things that were actually funny rather than things that were supposed to be funny. Victor liked her. I'm still not sure in what way, even now, looking back. Maybe he liked her as a friend. Maybe it was something else that he never let himself act on because acting on it wasn't in his plan and Victor was a man with a plan. Either way, she was his before she was mine in the social sense. She belonged to his circle first. I met her properly at a party junior year. I was there for reasons that were, again, not great. Victor was there because someone from the basketball team had invited him. We ended up in the same kitchen at the same time, and Diane was standing between us, holding a cup of soda and watching the two of us do our thing, the competitive orbiting, the subtle posturing, with this expression of mild, amused confusion. "Are you two brothers?" she asked. Victor and I both looked at her. "You interact like brothers," she said, "like you've known each other your whole lives, but you're also kind of annoyed by each other." "We grew up on the same street," Victor said. "And we bet on things," I said, without knowing why. "Whoever loses has to salute the winner." She looked at me with that slight tilt. "Who salutes more?" Victor looked away. He was trying not to smile. "It's about even," I said. It was not about even, but she didn't call me on it. She just tucked her hair behind her ear and moved on to something else, and I spent the rest of that party finding reasons to be near her. Victor noticed. Of course he noticed. And to his credit, he never said anything to claim her. Never made it a competition between us in that specific way. But I also knew that by pursuing Diane, I was stepping into territory that he considered at least partly his, and the friction between us quietly increased. Diane, for her part, took her time. She took a very long time. She told me later that she'd known almost immediately that there was something about me she wanted to understand. But she'd also known, she said, that I was the kind of person you had to be careful with, not because I was dangerous, but because I was unfinished. Like a house that's been framed and roofed but not wired yet. Structurally okay. Potentially everything. But dark inside. She wasn't wrong. By the time I was 21, I was trying to get my life in order. Not because of some dramatic moment of clarity, more like because the alternative was starting to look genuinely bleak, and I wasn't willing to follow my father all the way to where he'd ended up. I applied for the police academy. I know how that sounds. The thief's son applying to be a cop. But you have to understand, growing up in that house, with my mother's career as the one solid thing in our family, the badge had never been something I'd separated from respectability. It was what real people did. It was what real people were. And I'd spent my whole childhood being measured against that standard and coming up short, and the only thing I knew how to do with that was to try to clear the bar. Victor, of course, was also applying. He'd been planning it since he was 12. He'd done everything right, the fitness, the coursework, the internships, the references. He was a lock, and everyone knew it. I was a long shot, and everyone knew that, too. But I trained. I studied. I ran until my lungs were done and then ran more. I showed up to every prep session, and I didn't cut corners, and I was starting, genuinely starting, to feel like maybe this was the thing that was going to make the difference. Maybe this was the moment the story turned. And then Marcus Webb decided to use my name. Marcus was someone I'd known peripherally for years, part of the crowd I'd drifted near in my bad years but never fully committed to. He was smart in the wrong way. The kind of smart that goes to waste because it's pointed entirely at self-preservation. When he got caught running a theft ring out of the East Side, coordinated, sophisticated, cleaned out 6 houses in 3 months, he needed someone to point at. He pointed at me. He told the investigators that I'd been part of the operation, that I'd cased 2 of the houses, that I'd taken a cut. None of it was true, but he'd done his homework. He knew about my father. He knew about my record of being near trouble even when I wasn't in it. And he knew how to make a story sound credible to people who were already half disposed to believe it. My application was suspended pending investigation. My mother, who was still at the 3rd District and who had been starting to believe, that I was turning it around, had to recuse herself from anything related to my case and sit across the dinner table from me with her hands folded and her face doing that cracked watch thing while I told her I hadn't done it. She believed me. I want to be clear about that. She believed me completely. But belief doesn't stop a process once it's started. It just means someone stands in your corner while the process runs. The investigation dragged on for months. The charge was eventually dropped, not because I was vindicated in some dramatic, public way, but because the evidence against me was thin and Marcus's credibility fell apart under scrutiny. But by then the damage was done. My application window had closed. My name had been associated with a theft ring in police reports. I was the thief's son who might have been a thief too, and in Millhaven, that story didn't come with an asterisk. I left. I packed a bag and drove out of Millhaven on a Thursday morning without telling anyone but my mother where I was going, and she stood in the driveway and watched me go with her arms crossed over her chest and her chin up, the way she always held herself when she was holding herself together. "You're not done," she said. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. I drove until I needed gas, and then I drove more, and I didn't go back for a long time. The years away, the struggle, the transformation. I've heard enough of those stories to know how they go when they're cleaned up for an audience. The real version is messier. I moved to Cincinnati initially, where I got a job doing security work. Legitimate, boring, standing-at-a-door security. The kind that pays barely enough and requires almost nothing of you except your physical presence and your willingness to be ignored. I did that for 18 months. I took community college classes at night, trying to rebuild credentials, and I failed a statistics class twice before a night class professor named William Ferris sat down with me after the second failure and asked me what was actually going on. I told him more than I meant to. It happens sometimes. You're so used to carrying something that when someone actually asks, you just set it down. He listened. He asked questions that cut through my prepared version to the real one underneath. And then he said, "You don't have a study problem, you have an identity problem, you don't believe you're allowed to succeed." I told him that was a therapy thing to say, not a math thing. He said, "The math will follow. Work on the other thing first." I went to therapy, first time in my life. It was awkward and uncomfortable for the first month, and then it became the thing I looked forward to most during the week, which embarrassed me in a way that was probably itself something to talk to the therapist about. I'm compressing years here. It wasn't linear. There were setbacks, a period where I slid back into old patterns, a couple of decisions I'm still not proud of. A night I'd rather not describe in detail that ended with me sitting on a parking structure roof at 2 in the morning asking myself what I was actually doing with my life. But there were also things that held. The friendship that held was with a guy named Leon Burke. Leon had grown up 3 blocks from me in Millhaven. We'd known each other vaguely as kids, not well, the way you know half the people in a small neighborhood. In Cincinnati, by pure coincidence, we ended up at the same community college. Leon was methodical, honest, and funny in the driest way possible. He had a gift for saying the exact right thing with the minimum number of words. He also happened to be brilliant. Leon had a full ride to Ohio State that he deferred twice for reasons that were complicated and personal, and that he told me gradually over the course of 2 years. He was working his way back toward it, systematically. He had a plan. And watching Leon execute a plan with that level of patience and precision was, in its way, the thing that finally made something click in me. If he could do it, if a guy with his specific history of obstacles and setbacks could lay out a path and walk it 1 mile at a time without giving up, then I had no valid reason not to try the same thing. Leon went back to Ohio State. He got his degree in public administration. He took the civil service exam. He became, eventually, a federal administrative officer, an IAS equivalent in the federal system, the kind of bureaucratic power that moves quietly and accomplishes more than most people realize. And he remembered me. That matters later. Hang on. The news that Victor had graduated from the police academy reached me through my mother, who still gave me periodic updates on the neighborhood the way parents do, wrapped inside other news, offered casually, as if she wasn't sure whether I wanted to know. "Gerald's son graduated last week," she said on the phone. "Victor, he was at the top of the class. Patricia mentioned it at the station." I was quiet for a second. Good for him. You don't have to pretend it doesn't sting. I'm not pretending. She let that sit. My mother was very good at letting things sit. "You're going to get there, Adrian?" "I know." I didn't know. But I was starting to want to know again, which was different. Victor becoming an officer made something shift in me. Not jealousy, exactly, not anymore or not only. Something more complicated. Something that sat with the salute rule, with all those childhood bets, with his face that morning outside the rec center when he'd said, "I don't think you actually want that." I hadn't saluted him after that fight. We'd left it unresolved. It gnawed at me, more than I expected it to, which was probably about more than just a stupid bet. I went to see Leon. He was in Columbus by then, in a small apartment full of policy documents and half-read books, and a very patient girlfriend who brought us coffee, and then disappeared into another room because she understood when a conversation needed privacy. I laid it out for him, all of it, not just the Victor stuff, everything. The years in Cincinnati, the classes, the therapy, what I was working toward, what kept stopping me. Leon listened the way he always listened, with total attention and no expression, like a man taking a deposition. When I was done, he said, "Okay, what do you actually want?" "I want to be an officer," I said. "A real one? Okay, that's it, okay. What did you expect me to say? That it's complicated, that my record, your record is what it is," he said. "That's a logistics problem. Logistics are solvable. I'm asking what you want because you can solve logistics forever and never get anywhere if you don't know what you want." I looked at him. "I want to go home," I said. It came out quieter than I meant it to. "I want to go home and not be the thief's son. I want to be something else when I walk back into Millhaven." Leon nodded slowly. "Okay," he said again. "Let's figure out how to do that." It took 2 more years. I want to be honest about that, because stories about redemption have a way of collapsing the timeline. One revelation, one mentor, one montage, and suddenly you're transformed. The reality is that transformation is just a lot of consecutive days where you make a slightly better choice than you made the day before. And some days you don't manage even that, but you get up the next morning and try again. I reapplied to the academy. This time I went through the federal process rather than the municipal one. Leon knew people, navigated pathways, helped me understand that there were routes available to me that I hadn't known existed. The application process required me to be completely transparent about my history, including the Marcus Webb situation, including my father, including all of it. I wrote the most honest document of my life, laying out every bad decision and every contextual factor and every step I'd taken to change the trajectory. I don't know who read it. I don't know what they thought. But they let me in. The academy itself it was the hardest thing I'd ever done, and I want to be clear that I mean that in the best possible way. Not because it was militaristic or punishing, it was rigorous, fair, thorough. It required me to be better than my instincts in every area. The training, the coursework, the ethics modules, the scenario work. Every day I had to be the person I'd been trying to become rather than the person I'd been defaulting to. I graduated. Not at the top of my class, I want to be accurate, but I graduated clean, with commendations in 2 areas, with references that didn't need to hedge, and with my hand raised for the oath with a steadiness I hadn't known I had in me. I called my mother from the parking lot outside the building, still in my dress uniform. She didn't say anything for a long time when I told her. Then she said, "Your father would have," and stopped. "I know," I said. "He would have been so." She stopped again. "Mom, I know I'm okay." She wasn't okay in the way she was trying to mean, but she was okay in the way that mattered. She was proud, and the pride was reaching her through the grief, which is the best you can hope for in that kind of moment. I drove back to Millhaven the following week. I want to tell you that coming home was triumphant. I want to tell you the neighborhood lined up, and the sun came out, and the whole arc of the story resolved itself in the golden hour. But I pulled onto Carver Street on a Wednesday afternoon, and it was overcast, and Mrs. Galton, the same Mrs. Galton who'd reached for me on that terrible Tuesday 20 years ago, was taking out her recycling, and she looked up and saw me in my car and just waved. A normal wave, like I'd never left, like nothing had happened. I sat in my car for a minute after I parked. My mother came out of the house before I got to the door. She looked at me from the porch, really looked, the way she used to when I'd come home from somewhere, and she was calibrating whether I was okay. And then she came down the steps and put her arms around me and didn't say anything, and I held on longer than I probably needed to. "Come inside," she finally said. "I made the turkey thing." The turkey thing was a recipe she'd gotten from her own mother, complicated, mildly chaotic, requiring approximately 7 different bowls that never all got washed. It was the dinner she made when something important was happening. I ate 3 plates and felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was in the right place. The assignment came through shortly after. I was placed as an assistant commissioner of police in the Cochee district. The Cochee district, in Millhaven parlance, covered the east side. The same neighborhoods I'd grown up adjacent to, the same streets where some of my worst decisions had been made, where Marcus Webb had pointed at me with his soft, self-preserving hands. When I reported to the station for the first time, I found out who the sub-inspector in my district was. Victor Cheney. Of course it was. I'll tell you what it was like, those first few weeks in the same station as Victor. Formally, professionally, Victor was exactly what I expected him to be: precise, thorough, respected by the officers under him. He ran his shift with the same quality of focused stillness he'd had since childhood, and you could tell his team had calibrated to it. When Victor walked into a room, things got sharper. Personally, between us, it was the most sustained, low-grade awkwardness of my life. We were scrupulously polite. We were professional. We communicated through official channels when possible and in brief, correct exchanges when face-to-face was unavoidable. We did not mention the bet. We did not mention Diane. We did not mention our fathers or the street we'd grown up on or any of the accumulated weight of 30 years of knowing each other. The other officers noticed. They always notice these things. Police stations are, fundamentally, gossip ecosystems. There was one moment about 3 weeks in, when I was reviewing an evidence file in my office, and Victor knocked and came in and stood with the door open in that economical way of his, waiting until I looked up. "There's a situation on Monroe Street you should probably be aware of," he said. "Sit down, Victor." He sat. "Not about work," I said. He was quiet for a second. "What do you want to say?" "I want to say that I know this is weird. I know you didn't ask for me to be here, and I'm not asking you to pretend that any of this is normal." He looked at me steadily. "I don't have a problem with you being here." "Yes, you do." Another pause. Victor's pauses were always considered. He wasn't a man who needed to fill silence. "I have a problem," he said carefully, "with not knowing whether the person sitting in that chair is the person I think he might be or the person he used to be. Those are two different things." "I know. I'm not trying to, I know," I said. "I'm not either. I just needed you to know that I know." He nodded. He started to get up. "Victor," he stopped. "The Monroe Street thing," I said. "Tell me about it." He sat back down and told me about it. And we worked, and it was not warm exactly, but it was real. And real, I've learned, is what you build on. Part 14. Diane Patel was working as a social worker in the Kochi district. I found this out because her name appeared on a referral document that crossed my desk in my 4th week on the job. And I sat there for a moment with a very specific feeling that I cannot exactly describe. Recognition, I suppose, mixed with something that was either nostalgia or unresolved feeling, possibly both. I should probably tell you that I'd seen her once since high school. In Cincinnati, of all places, she'd been there for a conference. I'd been at a coffee shop 2 tables away, and we'd had a 40-minute conversation that was careful and warm and careful. We'd exchanged numbers. We'd texted occasionally over the following years, the kind of texting that kept a thread alive without pulling on it. Seeing her name on that document, though, in the context of coming home, that was different. She came into the station 2 weeks later for a case coordination meeting. She was 35 years old. She wore her hair differently now, shorter, and she had the particular quality of someone who has spent years in a demanding, emotionally expensive job and learned to hold it with steadiness rather than hardness. She saw me across the room and tilted her head very slightly, that same gesture completely unchanged, and then walked over and said, "I heard you were here." "Word travels." "In this district, Victor told me," she said. There it was. "Are you two talking?" I asked. "We've stayed in touch over the years. He's a friend, Adrian." She said it without defensiveness, just clarity. "He's been my friend since AP History. That's just true." "I know. I didn't mean anything by it." She looked at me with those careful eyes. "How are you actually?" "Actually good," I said, and meant it for the first time in a long time. We got coffee after the meeting. Then we got coffee again the following week. And then, gradually, in the honest way that things build when you've already done most of the groundwork years ago and you're both finally in the right place, something started. I won't give you the whole of it because some of it is just ours. But I want to tell you one thing she said to me early on, when we were sitting in her car outside a restaurant because it was raining, and neither of us wanted to end the conversation. She said, "Your dad used to scare me a little, not in a bad way, just the way he talked. He was so good at making you believe him, and I always thought that was something you'd inherited, the convincing you thing." I waited. "But I don't think that's actually what you got from him," she said. "I think what you got from him was the need to be worth believing, the desperate need to actually be the thing, not just sound like it. And that's different. That's better." I looked at the rain on the windshield. "I thought about him," I said. "A lot over the years. I thought about whether I hated him, whether I was supposed to." "Do you?" "No," I said. It was the first time I'd said that out loud, and it landed with a weight that surprised me. He was a man who couldn't figure out how to become real. He loved me, I actually believe that. He just loved me from inside a lie. And I spent a long time being angry that the love was contaminated by that. But lately, I tried to find the words. Lately, I think the love might be the part that's actually true, and the rest of it was just fear. Just him being afraid of losing the one real thing he had. Diane was quiet for a while. "That's a generous way to think about it," she said. "I know," I said. "It took me a while to get there." She reached over and took my hand, and we sat there in the rain for a long time, and neither of us needed to fill the silence. "I need to tell you about the Martinez situation. About 8 months into my assignment, a corruption allegation surfaced inside the district. Internal Affairs was involved. which meant everything became careful and formal, and everyone in the station was walking on glass. The allegation touched 3 officers I didn't know well, and it touched one I did. A senior officer named Darnell Hayes, who'd been in the district for 15 years and who everyone respected without quite examining why. The details don't need to be laid out fully. The short version is, Hayes had been taking money, not dramatically, not cartoonishly corrupt, not briefcases full of cash. Just quiet facilitations, the kind that go unnoticed for years because they're embedded in the texture of normal procedure, and everyone around them is too tired or too invested to look hard. He tried to pull me in. Not clumsily, Hayes was smart, subtle. He framed it as a professional courtesy. He made it sound like the most natural thing. I've thought about that conversation a lot since. About what I might have done 5 years earlier, 10 years earlier. About whether the version of me that drove out of Millhaven with a bag and an unresolved anger would have said yes, or maybe, or let me think about it. I said no. Clearly, directly, with no ambiguity. And then I went to the supervisor I trusted and I reported it, and I put my name on the report, and I let the process do what it was supposed to do. It's not a dramatic story. But it was the moment, the quiet, unglamorous moment, where I became certain that I was who I was trying to be. Victor found out about it later. Not from me, from the IA process. He came to my office and stood in the doorway the way he always stood in doorways, and he looked at me for a long moment. Hayes, he said. Yes, you reported him. Yes, he nodded, just that. Nodded and turned to leave and then stopped. For what it's worth, he said, I wouldn't have expected anything different from who you are now. It was the most Victor Shen had ever said to me about what he thought of me. Thank you, I said. He went back to his shift. The night before the district ceremony, the one where I was formally installed as ACP, with the whole protocol and the commendations and my mother sitting in the front row in the dress I hadn't seen since my grandmother's birthday, Victor found me in the parking lot of the station. It was late, almost everyone had gone home. The lot was mostly empty, a few cars under the yellow overhead lights, the sound of traffic 2 blocks away. I was standing by my car, not going anywhere yet, just standing. I do that sometimes, stand in places when I'm not ready to leave them. I didn't know he was there until I heard his footsteps. You heading out, he said. In a minute. He stood next to me. Not talking, just standing, looking at the same parking lot I was looking at, 2 men standing in the quiet of a Tuesday night. My dad told me something, he said after a while. I waited. He told me about your mom, about him. How it was before your dad came around. He paused. He never said anything bad about your father. Not once, not to me, not ever. I thought about that a lot when I was older. Thought it must have taken a lot for him to hold his tongue like that. Yeah. He respected her, Victor said. My dad, and I think part of respecting her was respecting that she loved your father even knowing what he was. That whatever he was, there was something real in it that she could see. I didn't say anything. I think I was hard on you, Victor said. Not the competing, that was just us, but the other stuff, the expectations. Holding you to a standard like? He didn't finish that sentence. He was quiet for a moment. You earned this, he said. You actually earned it. I want you to know I see that. I looked at him. He looked back at me. And then, very slowly, Victor Shen, who had beaten me more bets than I could count, who'd had his badge longer and his father's respect his whole life and every advantage of a straight path, brought his hand up to his forehead. And held it there. I've been holding on to a lot of things for a long time. Standing in that parking lot under the yellow lights, I let some of them go. I raised my hand back. Not as a winner receiving a salute, as 2 men acknowledging each other across everything that had happened, everything we'd been to each other, everything it had cost to get here. We held it for a second. Then we put our hands down. You going home? Victor said. Yeah, I said. Me too. He walked toward his car, then stopped and turned back. Diane makes that lemon thing on Sundays. I've been invited. I think she's going to invite you too. Yeah, I'm just saying it's not weird if you were worried it was weird. I wasn't, I said. He nodded, got in his car. I got in mine. I sat there for a minute before I started the engine. Thought about my father, about the note on the kitchen counter, about the pen spinning between his fingers and the laugh that filled every room and the terrible cost of a life built on something false. The love was real, he'd written, even when nothing else was. I think I finally understand what he meant by that. Love is the thing that was true about him, even when everything else wasn't. And the love reached me imperfectly, contaminated by lies, filtered through grief. But it reached me, and it shaped me, and not entirely in the way I spent years believing. He made me desperate to be the real thing. He made me understand in the most painful way possible what it costs to not be. I became a police officer because of my mother's integrity. But I became the specific kind of officer I am. The kind who said no to Hayes. The kind who put his name on the report. The kind who went to therapy in Cincinnati and failed statistics twice and got back up. Because of my father's example. His negative example. His cautionary example. But his example. I carry the name Cole onto Carver Street, and I carry it in a station where people know my history, and they see me, and they don't see a ghost of the man who knelt on the Murphy's driveway. They see a person who made a different choice. That's all any of us can do, I think, make a different choice. Carry what we're given and make a different choice. I started the car, I drove home, the porch light was on. My mother is retired now. She still lives on Carver Street. Victor made detective last year. His father, Gerald Shen, who is 68 years old and coaches youth basketball every Thursday night still, took him out for dinner to celebrate and apparently cried a little, which Victor told me with the dry delivery of a man who found it endearing but would never say so directly. Diane is Diane. She is the best person I know, and most days I can't quite believe she came back around. We're not engaged, not yet. But we eat lemon things on Sunday and talk about everything and nothing. And sometimes she tilts her head at me the way she's been doing since we were 16. And I tell her the true thing instead of the almost true thing, and she accepts it. Every time, that's what I was taught a lie can cost. And that's why I say the true thing every time.